President Trump making a strong demand on Twitter just moments ago, writing, "I hereby demand and will do so officially tomorrow that the Department of Justice look into whether or not the FBI, DOJ infiltrated or surveilled the Trump campaign for political purposes, and if any such demands or requests were made by people within the Obama administration." Let's get straight to CNN's Ryan Nobles, who is joining us live now from the White House. So Ryan, put all of this into context for us and what may have elicited this from the president.
Well, Fred, there's no doubt that the president has been, at the very least, annoyed with Robert Mueller's investigation to his campaign's conduct during 2016. But this weekend, it has gone on to a new level with the reports that the FBI had placed an informant attempting to get access to the Trump campaign before the election and then after, and that Robert Mueller's team then met with that informant and has used it as part of their investigation. The president attempting to imply that that meant that maybe even perhaps President Obama was behind this attempt, and he's called it an attempt to spy into his campaign. And today he's just put out a flurry of tweets talking about this particular topic. Let me read just a couple of them to you. He said at one point, "Now that the witch hunt has given up on Russia and is looking at the rest of the world," he's talking here about a New York Times report this morning that detailed a meeting with the president's son, Donald Trump Jr., and a group of businessmen from the Middle East that we now know the Mueller team is looking into. The tweet goes on to say they should easily be able to take it into the midterm elections where they can put some hurt on the Republican Party. Don't worry about Dems, FISA abuse, missing emails, or the fraudulent dossier. Another tweet from the president this morning. Whatever happened to the server at the center of so much corruption that the Democratic National Committee refused to hand over to the hard-charging, except in the case of Democrats, FBI? They broke into homes and offices early in the morning, but were afraid to take the server, he asked. Goes on to say, and why hasn't the Podesta brother been charged and arrested like others after being forced to close down his very large and successful firm? It is because he is very well connected. Democrats working in the swamp of Washington, D.C., he asks with a question mark. Now, Fred, all of these tweets, again, direct attacks at the FBI and the Department of Justice, but they've taken on a new level with that first tweet that you read off this morning where he said that he's now hereby declares that he's going to ask for a formal investigation into the DOJ's conduct in all of this. Now, we have really no idea what he means by demanding that someone looks into this. Does he mean a special prosecutor? Does he mean that someone from Congress looks into this? We're still attempting to get some context to all of this from the folks here at the White House, but we should point out that whenever we ask for context to the president's tweets, that the president, the White House usually tells us that his tweets speak for themselves. I want to also point out how Democrats are reacting to some of this news. Senator Mark Warner, who is the vice chairman of the very powerful Senate Intelligence Committee, which is, of course, conducting its own investigation into the 2016 campaign, had this to say about that New York Times report this morning.
If the Times story is true, we now have at least a second and maybe a third nation that was trying to lean in to this campaign. And I don't understand what the president doesn't get about the law that says if you have a foreign nation interfere in an American election, that's illegal. I would also like to find out if there is this other pattern, if the Times story is accurate, and there's this pattern that other countries were offering, and clearly the Trump campaign was receptive to these kind of offers, how that is not the beginnings of evidence of stuff that needs to be investigated.
So you see here the two sides of this story. Democrats like Mark Warner saying that the reason that this investigation kicked off was because there was some concern that perhaps the Trump campaign was acting illegally, and that's why the investigation continues. But of course, the president's view of this is much different. He believes that the FBI purposefully was attempting to essentially break into his campaign for the purpose of political reasons, which at this point there isn't a whole lot of evidence for, Fred. This clearly is something the president is not going to let go. I guess the broader question here is, how does that affect Robert Mueller and his investigation? Fred?
And, of course, all of this happening at about that 1-year anniversary of the start of this Robert Mueller investigation. Ryan Nobles, thank you so much. I want to check back with you momentarily. Meantime, for now, I want to bring in CNN legal analyst and former special special assistant to Robert Mueller at the Department of Justice. So, Michael, let me one more time bring up the latest tweet from the president, just so I can get real clarity on how you might be able to react to it. When the president says, I hereby demand and will do so officially tomorrow that the Department of Justice look into whether or not the FBI, DOJ infiltrated or surveilled the Trump campaign for political purposes. Just on that phrase, can the president do so?
Well, in theory, Fred, yes, he is the chief executive of the executive branch, and he can ask the FBI and the Department of Justice to look into matters that he thinks is worthy of inquiry. It is, though, to do that essentially contrary to about 40 years worth of processes between the White House and law enforcement agencies where to prevent an appearance of political meddling in federal law enforcement, administrations have, avoided doing that sort of stuff. They want to try to appear impartial and that the law enforcement agencies act according to what they determine to be facts worthy of inquiry. So he has the power, I believe, but he shouldn't, I think, create an appearance that he is investigating or seeking others to investigate that which he thinks are political rivals of his, as the case of the Clintons or Podesta in the later emails, or to undermine the investigation that Mueller is undertaking. So we'll have to see how it's executed. It's not desirable by any analysis of White House, FBI, DOJ communications policies that, as I said, have lasted for years and years and years across multiple administrations. But as a constitutional matter, I think he can ask those who work for him to carry out, a request to inquire.
Mm-hmm. And isn't there a difference, however, about an investigation that may be precipitated or an informant or looking into a campaign for political purposes versus whether another country might in any way be meddling?
Well, it's hard to sort of separate, sort of a purely domestic investigation from a counterintelligence investigation. That's counterintelligence being, the foreign interference, but they could have, as in the case of the FISA warrant against Carter Page or the recent stories about the FBI informant talking to George Papadopoulos, these things sort of bleed into one another. So the sort of hallmark of, sort of non-interference has been that the White House, irrespective of whether it's a counterintelligence investigation or a domestic investigation, leave it to the law enforcement agencies to act according to their own internal policies to determine whether or not criminal laws have been violated.
I also want to bring into the conversation, Michael, two others about the political influences here. CNN political and national security analyst David Sanger. He also works for the New York Times, and CNN political analyst and senior political correspondent for The Hill, Amy Parnes. All right, good to see you both. So, David, it appears as though the president's tweets are precipitated by a few different reports. Reports of a possible informant or someone who had made contact with people working for the Trump campaign. At the same time, this new New York Times reporting talking about emissaries of at least 3 other countries, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, among 2 of them, who may have met with Donald Trump Jr. And these items may have inspired the president to say, wait a minute, there are too many people who have been looking into our campaign, the activity of such, and so now I want to get to the bottom of who's responsible. Might it even be the Obama administration? Is that what you see here?
Well, pretty close, pretty close. Look, he woke up angry this morning, it seems, or at least angry enough to tweet on 3 different counts. The story that my colleagues in the Times had suggested that Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates also had a parallel effort, completely separate from whatever the Russians were doing, to try to at least offer some help in the social media sphere. Not at all clear whether the campaign took that up. So that was one. The second was that the president then tweeted about the FBI's failure to get the physically get the server from the Democratic National Committee. A legitimate concern, why they didn't take possession of the server itself, but they certainly had all the data from the server because it had been downloaded previously by a private firm, CrowdStrike, co-founded by a former FBI cyber investigator, and that data was turned over to the FBI. It would have been better, I think, had they given them the server themselves. And then the third thing that's come along now is his argument that the Obama administration had infiltrated the campaign. We don't see any evidence of that. In fact, I think the bigger question would have been, had the FBI had the evidence that at least these three members of the campaign appeared to have extensive Russian contacts, were they supposed to ignore that in the months prior to
In fact, that was
to
some of the
campaign?
criticism that the Obama administration did get, that perhaps if they knew more about how Russia had been making overtures to the Trump campaign, why is it that publicly it wasn't known what the Obama administration may have been doing about that?
Yeah, if anything, I think the evidence shows the Obama administration kind of underreacted.
And Amy?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that. I mean, this is an investigation that has gone on for a year now. He is clearly annoyed by what has been happening. I think he woke up clearly reading this story yesterday. He knows that this is another drip, drip, drip in this larger case against him. And he's trying to kind of, change the subject and go back to Hillary Clinton and go back to his old enemies, so to speak, to kind of change the subject. And I think that's exactly what he's trying to do here, when in fact, he tries to make the point that there is no collusion. But, the Mueller investigation has sort of, come down hard on Manafort and Rick Gates and other people. And this is just another drop that, goes against him and what he stands for. And I think this is really annoying to him.